This morning's revelations from the Globe and Mail represent something unprecedented in modern North American relations. According to two senior government officials speaking anonymously, the Canadian Armed Forces have developed a theoretical military model examining how Canada might respond to a hypothetical American invasion. This marks the first time in over a century that Canadian military planners have formally considered such a scenario involving their closest ally and NATO partner. Let's step back and examine what we actually know, what we don't know, and why this development matters far beyond the immediate headlines. The story itself is remarkable not just for what it reveals, but for what it tells us about how dramatically the strategic calculus has shifted in North America over the past year. According to the reporting, this isn't a military plan in the operational sense. Military officials are careful to distinguish between a conceptual model and an actionable directive. A model is essentially a theoretical framework that explores possibilities and responses. It's the kind of exercise that military institutions routinely conduct to understand various scenarios, even unlikely ones. What makes this particular modeling exercise extraordinary is that it involves the United States, a country that has been Canada's primary security partner for nearly 8 decades. The officials who spoke to the Globe described tactics that would draw heavily from asymmetric warfare strategies observed in Afghanistan, both during the Soviet occupation and later during coalition operations. This isn't a coincidence or a casual reference. Asymmetric warfare represents the strategic reality that faces any smaller military force confronting a vastly superior conventional army. The mathematics are straightforward. The United States military operates with a defense budget roughly 15 times larger than Canada's. Conventional resistance would be strategically meaningless. But here's where the story becomes particularly significant from an analytical perspective. The very fact that Canadian military leadership is conducting this type of modeling suggests a fundamental shift in how Ottawa views the reliability of American strategic partnership. Military institutions don't waste time and resources on theoretical exercises unless there's some assessed probability that the scenario could materialize. The question isn't whether Canadian generals believe an American invasion is likely. The question is why they believe it's worth modeling at all. The timeline matters here. This modeling exercise has reportedly taken place against the backdrop of increasingly strained Canada-US relations under the current administration. We've seen repeated references from Washington to Canada becoming America's 51st state, threats of massive tariffs, and demands for renegotiated trade agreements that many Canadian officials view as fundamentally one-sided. The Pentagon continues to maintain professional relationships with Canadian counterparts, but the political environment has created uncertainties that simply didn't exist in previous decades. Consider what military planners on both sides of the border understand about modern warfare. Any hypothetical conflict would likely begin with information warfare, economic pressure, and political isolation rather than immediate military action. The modeling reportedly envisions scenarios where traditional alliance structures like NORAD would be dissolved before any kinetic action occurred. This suggests Canadian planners are thinking several moves ahead, considering not just military responses, but the broader strategic environment that would precede any actual conflict. The asymmetric strategy references are particularly telling. Afghanistan demonstrated that determined populations with local knowledge, supply lines, and political support can sustain resistance against technologically superior forces for extended periods. Canadian planners would understand that any theoretical resistance strategy would need to focus on making occupation politically and economically unsustainable rather than achieving conventional military victories. This is precisely the calculation that made Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan so problematic for major powers despite their overwhelming military advantages. Geography plays a crucial role in how any such scenario might develop. Canada's vast territory, harsh climate conditions, and dispersed population centers would present significant challenges for any occupying force. The country's energy infrastructure, transportation networks, and communication systems are distributed across enormous distances. Controlling and maintaining security for such infrastructure would require enormous resources and personnel commitments. These are exactly the factors that military modelers consider when developing theoretical scenarios. What's particularly noteworthy is that this story emerged through leaks to Canadian media rather than official government communications. This suggests internal debates within Canadian security establishments about how to respond to changing strategic realities. When career military and government officials choose to share sensitive information with journalists, it typically indicates significant concern about policy directions and a desire to influence public debate. The timing of these revelations coincides with other significant developments in North American security relationships. Canada has been exploring expanded defense cooperation with European NATO allies, participating in Arctic military exercises, and developing strategic partnerships that don't rely exclusively on American coordination. These aren't necessarily preparations for conflict, but they do represent efforts to diversify Canada's security options in an increasingly unpredictable strategic environment. From Washington's perspective, this type of Canadian military modeling probably isn't surprising to defense officials who understand how alliance dynamics work under stress. Professional military institutions prepare for various contingencies as a matter of standard practice. The Pentagon likely conducts similar theoretical exercises regarding allies and potential adversaries alike. What matters isn't the existence of such planning, but how it reflects broader trends in international relations and alliance structures. The economic dimensions of this story deserve attention as well. Modern conflicts increasingly involve economic warfare that can be far more effective than conventional military pressure. Canada's economy remains heavily dependent on trade relationships with the United States, particularly in energy, agriculture, and manufacturing sectors. Any theoretical resistance strategy would need to account for immediate economic disruptions that could affect millions of Canadian civilians. This creates complex strategic calculations about sustainability and popular support. Looking at historical precedents, there are few cases of established democratic allies engaging in military conflict against each other in the modern era. The institutional, economic, and cultural connections between Canada and the United States run deep across multiple sectors of both societies. Business relationships, family connections, and shared infrastructure create powerful incentives for peaceful resolution of disputes. But history also shows that alliance structures can shift rapidly when political leadership changes or strategic interests diverge significantly. The role of other international actors in any hypothetical scenario adds another layer of complexity to this analysis. Russia and China would likely view any serious deterioration in Canada-US relations as a strategic opportunity to expand their influence in North America. European NATO allies would face difficult decisions about how to respond to conflict between two founding alliance members. These international dimensions would shape how any theoretical Canadian resistance strategy might develop and what external support might be available. Intelligence and information warfare capabilities represent another crucial factor in any modern conflict scenario. Both countries possess sophisticated intelligence services with extensive knowledge of each other's capabilities, infrastructure, and strategic planning. Any theoretical resistance strategy would need to account for the fact that traditional operational security methods might be compromised by signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, and human intelligence networks that have been developed over decades of cooperation. The psychological and political aspects of this story may be more significant than the immediate military implications. Public awareness that Canadian military leadership is considering such scenarios changes how citizens think about their relationship with the United States. It introduces questions about sovereignty, independence, and strategic autonomy that haven't been central to Canadian political discourse since World War II. These psychological effects can influence voting patterns, policy preferences, and public support for various diplomatic and defense initiatives. Climate change and Arctic sovereignty issues provide important context for understanding why these scenarios are being considered now rather than in previous decades. The Arctic region contains significant energy resources and is becoming increasingly accessible due to changing ice conditions. Multiple countries, including Russia, China, and the United States, have expressed interest in expanding their Arctic presence. Canada's sovereignty over its Arctic territories has become a more prominent strategic consideration as competition for these resources intensifies. The technological dimensions of modern warfare also influence how theoretical resistance strategies might develop. Cyber capabilities, electronic warfare, and space-based systems have become central to contemporary military operations. Canada possesses certain technological advantages in telecommunications, satellite communications, and cyber defense that could be relevant in any asymmetric conflict scenario. But these capabilities also create vulnerabilities that would need to be considered in strategic planning. What we don't know about this story is perhaps as important as what has been revealed. The timing of when this modeling began, the specific scenarios considered, the resources devoted to the exercise, and the recommendations produced all remain unclear. We also don't know how widely this analysis has been shared within Canadian government circles or what policy implications it might have for future defense planning and procurement decisions. The international legal framework surrounding any such scenario presents complex questions about sovereignty, self-determination, and the obligations of other nations under international law. The United Nations Charter, NATO founding documents, and various bilateral treaties create legal obligations that would be tested under extreme scenarios. These legal considerations would influence how other countries might respond and what legitimacy various actions might have under international law. Looking forward, this story raises important questions about the future of North American security cooperation and alliance structures more broadly. If traditional partnerships become less reliable, how do middle powers like Canada adapt their strategic planning? What alternative security arrangements become possible or necessary? How do domestic political considerations influence these strategic calculations? The economic integration between Canada and the United States creates mutual dependencies that extend far beyond traditional trade relationships. Supply chains, financial systems, and infrastructure networks cross the border seamlessly in normal circumstances. Any serious deterioration in political relations would have immediate economic consequences for both countries that could affect global markets and create pressure for rapid resolution of disputes. Perhaps most importantly, this story illustrates how quickly strategic assumptions can change in international relations. Partnerships that seem permanent and reliable can come under stress when political leadership changes or when global power dynamics shift. Military institutions must continuously update their planning to reflect new realities, even when those realities involve previously unthinkable scenarios. The broader implications extend beyond Canada and the United States to alliance structures worldwide. If long-standing democratic allies begin seriously preparing for potential conflict with each other, what does this mean for NATO, for regional security agreements, and for the international system more generally? These questions don't have simple answers, but they're becoming more relevant as global power structures continue to evolve. What makes this story particularly significant is that it emerged from professional military institutions rather than political rhetoric or media speculation. When career military officers with access to classified intelligence begin modeling scenarios that were previously considered impossible, it suggests that something fundamental has changed in the strategic environment. Whether that change proves temporary or permanent will depend on political developments that remain uncertain. The challenge for analysts and policymakers is distinguishing between prudent contingency planning and genuine preparation for conflict. Military institutions have responsibilities to consider various scenarios precisely because their job is to be prepared for contingencies that political leaders hope will never occur. The existence of such planning doesn't necessarily indicate belief that conflict is likely, but it does suggest that previously reliable assumptions about partnership and cooperation may no longer be taken for granted. This development represents one of those moments when the underlying structures of international relations become visible in ways that are usually hidden from public view. We're seeing how professional military and security institutions adapt their thinking when faced with changing political realities. The story provides insight into strategic planning processes that typically remain classified for decades after the events they address. As this story continues to develop, the key questions will focus on how it influences actual policy decisions rather than just theoretical planning exercises. Will Canada accelerate efforts to diversify its security partnerships? Will defense spending priorities shift to reflect new strategic assumptions? Will diplomatic relations change in ways that make these scenarios more or less likely? These are the developments that will determine whether this story represents a temporary adjustment to changing circumstances or a fundamental shift in North American security relationships that will define the region for years to come.